Captain Sarah Chun had been staring at the same maintenance report for the past 20 minutes, her coffee growing cold as she watched through the hangar window. Outside, the F-16 Fighting Falcons roared to life, their engines screaming as they prepared for another training mission. Another mission she wouldn't be part of. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she sat, one of the most qualified pilots on Nellis Air Force Base, relegated to paperwork and ground duties while less experienced aviators took to the skies. The reason was always the same: administrative concerns and pending review. 3 years of the same bureaucratic nonsense, and Sarah had stopped asking when the review would be complete. Still watching the birds fly without you. Staff Sergeant Martinez slid into the chair across from her, setting down his own steaming mug. Martinez had been her crew chief before the grounding, and he'd made it clear more than once that he thought the whole situation was ridiculous. Sarah shrugged, finally looking away from the window, just making sure they don't scratch the paint. Her voice carried the practiced indifference of someone who'd learned to hide disappointment behind humor. Martinez wasn't buying it. He'd known Sarah since her first assignment to Nellis, watched her climb from a green second lieutenant to one of the most respected pilots on base. Well, respected by everyone except the brass who mattered. You know, Thompson nearly put his bird into the ground yesterday during the intercept exercise, Martinez said, referring to one of the newer pilots. Kid's got the reflexes of a sedated sloth, but somehow he's cleared for combat air patrol while you're stuck reviewing fuel consumption reports. The comment stung because it was true. Sarah had watched the gun camera footage from Thompson's training flight, seen the hesitation and overcorrection that nearly turned an F-16 into expensive scrap metal. Yet Thompson would be back in the air this afternoon, while she'd be here, calculating fuel efficiency metrics. Sarah Chin's story hadn't started with grounding orders and paperwork. 5 years earlier, she'd been the top graduate from the Air Force Academy, first in her flight training class, and the youngest pilot ever to complete the F-16 qualification program at Luke Air Force Base. Her instructors had used words like prodigy and natural-born aviator. The Air Force had big plans for Captain Chun. Those plans had started unraveling during her first deployment to Afghanistan. Sarah's squadron had been providing close air support for ground operations when everything went sideways. A routine mission became a nightmare when Taliban fighters overran a forward operating base, trapping a company of Marines behind enemy lines. The rescue operation required precise flying through mountainous terrain under heavy fire. Sarah had volunteered immediately, but her squadron commander, Major Harrison, had other ideas. He'd assigned the mission to himself and 2 senior pilots, relegating Sarah to backup status. Standard protocol, he'd explained. Let the experienced aviators handle the dangerous work. What happened next would haunt Sarah for years. Major Harrison's formation had been ambushed in the mountain passes, taking heavy ground fire from concealed positions. Harrison's aircraft suffered engine damage, and he was forced to abort. The second pilot, Captain Williams, had his hydraulics shot out and barely made it back to base. The third pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, had been shot down and captured. With the rescue mission failed and a pilot in enemy hands, the situation became desperate. Sarah had requested permission to attempt a solo rescue flight, arguing that a single aircraft might succeed where the formation had failed. Her request was denied. Too dangerous, too risky, too much chance of losing another pilot. Instead, the brass had called in an Apache helicopter squadron for the rescue attempt. The Apaches had better armor and were designed for close ground support, but they were also slower and had limited range. By the time they reached the crash site, Brooks was gone, moved to an unknown location where he'd spend the next 8 months as a prisoner. Sarah knew she could have made the difference. A single F-16, flying fast and low, might have reached Brooks before the Taliban could move him. She'd studied the terrain, calculated the approach angles, and identified at least 3 possible routes that could have avoided the heaviest concentrations of enemy fire. But she'd been overruled, and a fellow pilot paid the price. The official after-action report praised the decision-making of the senior officers, and noted that losing additional aircraft would have made the situation worse. Sarah wasn't mentioned by name, but she knew there were unofficial discussions about her overly aggressive attitude and concerning disregard for proper chain of command. Those discussions had followed her back to Nellis, whispered conversations that painted her as a maverick who couldn't be trusted with high-stakes missions. The fact that she'd been right about the rescue mission only seemed to make things worse. Nobody likes to be reminded of their failures, especially by a junior officer who'd been sidelined for their own safety. The grounding had come gradually, disguised as temporary measures that somehow became permanent. First, she'd been pulled from combat training exercises pending a routine evaluation of her psychological fitness. The evaluation found nothing wrong, but somehow Sarah remained grounded pending additional review. Then came the administrative assignments, the endless paperwork, and the slow realization that her flying career was being deliberately sabotaged. Sarah had tried fighting back through proper channels. She'd requested meetings with her commanding officers, submitted formal appeals, and even reached out to the Inspector General's office. Every door led to the same polite deflection. Her superiors expressed sympathy for her situation while explaining that their hands were tied by regulations and procedures that seemed to exist solely to keep her on the ground. The worst part wasn't the professional frustration, though that was certainly crushing. The worst part was watching other pilots make mistakes that could have been avoided, seeing missions planned by officers who'd never flown combat sorties, and knowing that her expertise was being wasted while people with less experience made life and death decisions. Martinez finished his coffee and stood to leave. You know what really gets me about this whole situation? He paused at the door, looking back at Sarah. Half the pilots on this base would wash out of flight training if they had to meet the same standards you exceeded on your worst day. But somehow you're the one sitting on the bench. After Martinez left, Sarah returned to her maintenance reports, but her mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her father the night before. Colonel David Chun, retired Air Force, had served 3 tours in Vietnam and understood better than most what it meant to be sidelined by politics and bureaucracy. Sometimes the system gets it wrong, sweetheart, he told her over the phone. But systems change, and eventually the people who matter realize what they've lost. You just have to be ready when that moment comes. Sarah wasn't sure she believed him anymore. 3 years was a long time to wait for a moment that might never arrive. How long could she maintain her proficiency without regular flight time? How long before she really did become unfit for combat duty, not because of some imagined psychological problem, but because she'd been away from the cockpit too long? The afternoon brought its usual routine of meetings and administrative tasks. Sarah attended a briefing on new maintenance protocols, reviewed safety reports from the morning training flights, and participated in a planning session for next month's red flag exercise. She contributed where she could, offering insights from her experience and technical knowledge, but always as an observer rather than a participant. During the red flag planning meeting, the discussion turned to close air support scenarios. The exercise would simulate combat operations in urban environments, requiring precise coordination between air and ground forces. It was exactly the type of mission Sarah excelled at, the kind of flying that required split-second decisions and perfect execution. We'll need our most experienced pilots for the urban scenarios, said Colonel Davidson, the exercise commander. The margin for error is essentially zero when you're operating that close to friendly forces. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Davidson's eyes passed over her without acknowledgement. She was sitting right there, literally in the same room, but she might as well have been invisible. The most experienced pilots would be chosen from a pool that deliberately excluded her, regardless of her actual qualifications. Lieutenant Thompson raised his hand. Sir, I'd like to volunteer for the urban scenarios. I've been studying the procedures, and I think I'm ready for the challenge. Sarah had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing. Thompson, who'd nearly crashed during a routine intercept exercise, wanted to fly close air support missions in simulated urban combat. It would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. That's the kind of attitude we need, Thompson, Davidson replied. We'll definitely consider you for the mission roster. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics and safety protocols, but Sarah barely heard any of it. She was thinking about her father's words, about being ready when the moment came. But what if the moment never came? What if she spent the rest of her career watching from the sidelines while less qualified pilots took the risks and earned the glory she'd been denied? That evening, Sarah found herself in the base gym, working out her frustration on the punching bag. Physical training had become her outlet, a way to maintain the peak physical condition required for combat flying even though she wasn't allowed to fly combat missions. The irony wasn't lost on her. You're going to put a hole through that bag if you keep hitting it like that. The voice belonged to Major Jessica Pierce, one of the few senior officers who treated Sarah with anything approaching fairness. Pierce was an A-10 pilot with 2 combat deployments and a reputation for speaking her mind, regardless of the political consequences. Sarah stopped punching and grabbed a towel. Just trying to stay in shape, ma'am. Pierce stepped closer, lowering her voice. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you still current on your qualifications? The question caught Sarah off guard. Her proficiency ratings had expired months ago due to lack of flight time, but she'd been studying constantly, reviewing procedures, and staying current on aircraft systems. Technically, no, ma'am, but I could pass any proficiency check you wanted to give me. Pierce nodded slowly. That's what I figured. Listen, I can't promise anything, but there might be some opportunities coming up. Situations where we need pilots who can think on their feet and make quick decisions. If that happens, are you ready? Sarah felt a surge of hope she hadn't experienced in months. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Good. Keep studying, keep training, and be ready to prove yourself when the time comes. And Sarah? Pierce paused at the door. When that time comes, make sure you're better than everyone else in the room, because you'll only get one chance to show them they were wrong. That night, Sarah lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, Pierce's words echoing in her mind. She'd been ready for 3 years, maintaining her edge through pure determination and stubborn pride. But ready for what? Another disappointment? Another polite deflection? Still, something in Pierce's tone suggested this might be different. Pierce wasn't the type to offer false hope or empty encouragement. If she was hinting at opportunities, there might actually be something on the horizon. Sarah rolled over and reached for the flight manual on her nightstand. She'd read it cover to cover dozens of times, but she opened it again anyway. Her father had been right about one thing. She needed to be ready when the moment came. Because in the military, moments of opportunity arrived without warning, and they disappeared just as quickly if you weren't prepared to seize them. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines as the night shift prepared for training flights. Somewhere out there, pilots were doing the job she'd been trained for, flying the missions she should have been flying. But Sarah Chin wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow would bring another day of paperwork and administrative duties, another day of watching others take to the skies while she remained grounded. But Pierce's words had kindled something that had been dormant for too long. Hope, determination, and the absolute certainty that when her moment finally came, she'd be ready to prove everyone wrong. The Air Force had kept her grounded for 3 years, but they hadn't broken her. And when the time came to show what she could really do, Sarah Chan intended to remind everyone why she'd been considered a prodigy in the first place. The emergency alarm pierced through the desert morning like a blade through silence. Sarah Chan dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against the concrete floor of the maintenance hangar as the base-wide announcement echoed across Nellis Air Force Base. All personnel, this is not a drill. We have multiple aircraft in distress approximately 40 miles northeast of the base. Search and rescue operations are commencing immediately. All available pilots report to the operations center. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard those words, all available pilots. After 3 years of being excluded from everything, could this finally be her moment? She sprinted toward the operations center, her boots echoing through the corridors as other personnel rushed to their emergency stations. The operations center was pure chaos. Radios crackled with urgent communications, officers shouted orders across the room, and the large tactical display showed a terrifying picture. 4 red dots marked aircraft positions, all showing emergency transponder codes. One that wasn't moving at all. Colonel Davidson stood at the center of it all, his face grim as he processed reports from multiple sources. Sarah pushed through the crowd of personnel, close enough to hear the details that made her blood run cold. Bandit's flight took ground fire during a training exercise in the restricted area, Davidson announced to the assembled officers. 2 aircraft made emergency landings at auxiliary strips. One is limping back to base with engine damage, and Bandit's 4 is down in hostile territory. Hostile territory. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what that meant. The restricted area northeast of Nellis wasn't just empty desert. It was where the base conducted realistic combat training, complete with simulated enemy positions and live-fire exercises. But today, something had gone wrong. Today, the enemy fire wasn't simulated. "Sir, what's the threat situation?" Major Pierce stepped forward, her A-10 pilot training evident in her calm, professional demeanor despite the crisis. Davidson's expression darkened further. "Intelligence suggests we're dealing with a well-equipped militia group that's been operating in the area for several weeks. They've got military-grade weapons, including surface-to-air missiles. Bandit's 4 went down after taking an SA-7 hit to the engine compartment." The room fell silent except for the constant chatter of radio communications. Everyone understood the implications. An American pilot was down in territory controlled by hostile forces armed with military weapons. This wasn't a training exercise gone wrong. This was a real combat situation on American soil. "What's the status of the pilot?" Pierce asked the question everyone was thinking. "Captain Rodriguez is alive and in contact via emergency radio," Davidson replied. "But his position is compromised. The hostiles are actively searching for him, and he's got maybe 2 hours before they find his location." 2 hours. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating distances, flight times, and tactical considerations. The down pilot was 40 miles out, deep in mountainous terrain that would provide cover for the enemy, but also complicate any rescue attempt. Traditional search and rescue helicopters would be sitting ducks for surface-to-air missiles. "What about combat air patrol?" someone called out from the back of the room. Davidson shook his head. "Already tried. We sent 2 F-16s on initial response, but they took heavy fire and had to abort. The enemy has multiple SAM sites in the area, and they're using the terrain to maximum advantage. Our pilots can't get close enough to provide effective support." Sarah felt the familiar frustration building inside her chest. This was exactly the type of situation she'd trained for, the kind of mission that required precision flying and tactical innovation. But she was still on the outside looking in, still the grounded pilot whose expertise was being ignored while a fellow aviator's life hung in the balance. "Sir, what about a low-level approach?" Major Pierce suggested. "Single aircraft, flying below radar coverage, fast insertion and extraction." "Too risky," Davidson replied immediately. "We already lost 1 pilot today. I'm not sending another aircraft into that meat grinder without a solid plan." "With respect, sir," Pierce pressed, "Captain Rodriguez doesn't have time for us to develop a solid plan. He needs help now." The debate continued, but Sarah could see the problem clearly. Everyone in the room was thinking conventionally, approaching the rescue as a standard operation that followed established procedures. But standard procedures weren't going to work against an enemy that had already proved they could counter conventional tactics. Sarah knew she should stay quiet. She was a grounded pilot with no official role in this operation. Speaking up would only remind everyone of her controversial status and probably get her escorted from the room. But Captain Rodriguez was running out of time, and her fellow aviator's life was more important than her career prospects. "Colonel Davidson, sir." Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the arguments and discussions. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Davidson's expression was unreadable, but she could see surprise, and annoyance in equal measure. Captain Chun, you shouldn't be here. This is an active operation. Sir, I request permission to volunteer for the rescue mission. The words came out steady and clear, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Davidson's face hardened. Captain, you're not current on your qualifications, and you're not assigned to operational duties. The answer is no. Sir, I can pass any proficiency check you want to give me right now, Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. I know that terrain better than anyone else in this room, and I have a plan that could work. Chun, stand down, Davidson ordered, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. This is not the time for grandstanding. But Sarah couldn't stand down, not when she knew she might be Rodriguez's best hope for survival. Colonel, with respect, conventional approaches aren't going to work. The enemy has proven they can counter our standard tactics. But a single aircraft, flying terrain-following profiles at extremely low altitude, using natural features for concealment, that might succeed where formation flying failed. The room was dead quiet now, everyone focused on the confrontation between the grounded pilot and her commanding officer. Sarah could feel the weight of 3 years of frustration and determination behind her words, but she kept her voice professional and controlled. Major Pierce stepped forward. Sir, Captain Chen has a point about conventional approaches, and she does know that terrain better than most of our current pilots. Davidson's jaw tightened. Major Pierce, Captain Chun has been grounded for good reasons. This is not the time to second-guess those decisions. What if it is? The question came from an unexpected source, Staff Sergeant Martinez, who'd been monitoring radio communications from a corner console. Sir, I've been listening to the rescue coordination frequency. The helicopters can't get close enough because of the SAM threat. The fast movers can't provide close support because they can't identify friendly positions in the terrain. We're running out of options. Sarah seized the moment. Colonel, I'm not asking you to trust me because of my record or my training. I'm asking you to trust me because Captain Rodriguez is going to die if we don't try something different. Give me an aircraft and 30 minutes, and I'll bring him home. For a long moment, Davidson stared at her without speaking. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, the desire to maintain command authority versus the reality that standard options weren't working. Finally, he turned to the tactical display, studying the terrain features and enemy positions. Even if I wanted to authorize this, which I don't, you're not current on your qualifications, Davidson said finally. Regulations require sir. Emergency authority allows field commanders to waive qualification requirements in life-threatening situations, Pierce interrupted. If you want to certify Captain Chen's proficiency, you have the authority to do so. Davidson spun around to face Pierce, his eyes flashing with anger. Major, are you seriously suggesting I put an unqualified pilot in an aircraft during a combat situation? Sir, I'm suggesting that Captain Chen might not be unqualified, Pierce replied calmly. I'm suggesting that administrative grounding and actual proficiency are two different things. The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, weak but clear. Mayday, Mayday, this is Bandits 4. I can hear vehicles approaching my position from the east. Request immediate assistance, over. The transmission sent a jolt through everyone in the room. Rodriguez was running out of time, and they all knew it. Sarah stepped closer to Davidson, her voice urgent but controlled. Sir, you know my record before the grounding. You know I had the highest scores in my flight class, the fastest qualification times, and 0 safety incidents. Nothing has changed except administrative status. My flying ability is still there. Davidson looked around the room, taking in the faces of his officers and enlisted personnel. Sarah could see him weighing options, calculating risks, and struggling with a decision that could end his career if it went wrong. But it could also save a pilot's life if it went right. Rodriguez's position is compromised, came another radio transmission, this one from the Rescue Coordination Center. We estimate 15 minutes before hostile forces reach his location. 15 minutes. Sarah felt time slipping away like sand through her fingers. In 15 minutes, This whole discussion would be academic because Rodriguez would be captured or worse. She had to make Davidson understand that this wasn't about her career or his authority. This was about bringing a fellow aviator home alive. "Colonel Davidson, sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying every ounce of conviction she possessed. "I know you don't trust me. I know you think I'm a risk to this unit. But right now, I might be Captain Rodriguez's only chance. Let me prove that your concerns were wrong. Let me prove that I'm still the pilot you thought I was before everything went sideways." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Davidson stared at the tactical display, then at Sarah, then back at the display. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If I do this, if I put you in that cockpit, you follow orders exactly. No improvisation, no maverick nonsense. You execute the mission profile I approve, and you bring both yourself and Rodriguez back alive. Are we clear?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Crystal clear, sir." Davidson turned to Pierce. "Major, you'll monitor the mission from here and provide tactical coordination. If Captain Chun deviates from the approved flight plan by even a degree, you scrub the mission immediately." "Understood, sir." "And Chun?" Davidson fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. "This is your one chance. If you screw this up, if you prove that the grounding was justified, your career in the Air Force is over. Forever." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of 3 years of frustration and anticipation settling on her shoulders. "I won't let you down, sir. I won't let Rodriguez down." As the operations center erupted into activity around her, Sarah felt a strange calm descending over her mind. The moment her father had talked about, the opportunity Major Pierce had hinted at, had finally arrived. Now she had to prove that 3 years of waiting hadn't dulled her edge, that the pilot who'd graduated first in her class was still there underneath all the paperwork and administrative duties. Captain Rodriguez was counting on her. Colonel Davidson was watching her every move. And somewhere deep in the Nevada desert, hostile forces were closing in on a downed American pilot who needed someone crazy enough, skilled enough, and desperate enough to fly into hell to bring him home. Sarah Chun had been grounded for 3 years, but in the next few hours, she would either prove that the grounding had been wrong or prove that it had been justified all along. Either way, the waiting was finally over. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision across the F-16's instrument panel, muscle memory taking over despite 3 years away from an active cockpit. The jet felt like an extension of her body, every control familiar and responsive under her touch. She'd forgotten how much she'd missed this feeling, the vibration of the engine, the smell of jet fuel, the weight of the helmet on her head. "Dragon 1, this is Nellis Control." Major Pierce's voice crackled through her headset. "Radio check and system status report." "Nellis Control, Dragon 1. Radio check is 5x5. All systems green," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The call sign Dragon 1 felt appropriate. After 3 years of being kept in a cage, she was finally being unleashed. Through her canopy, she could see the maintenance crew finishing their final checks. Staff Sergeant Martinez gave her a thumbs up from beside the aircraft, his expression mixing pride and concern. He'd been the one to prep the F-16 in record time, ensuring every system was perfect for what everyone knew was a nearly impossible mission. The tactical situation had gotten worse during her pre-flight preparations. Captain Rodriguez had reported enemy vehicles within a half-mile of his position, and his emergency radio was down to emergency power. Intelligence estimated he had maybe 30 minutes before hostile forces found his hiding spot in the rocky terrain. Sarah's mission was straightforward in concept, but terrifying in execution. She would fly a low-level penetration route through the mountains, avoiding known SAM sites while using terrain features to mask her approach. Once she reached Rodriguez's position, she'd have to identify his exact location, clear any threats in the immediate area, and coordinate his rescue. The problem was that clearing threats meant engaging enemy forces with air-to-ground weapons while flying at extremely low altitude in mountainous terrain. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she'd become another casualty rather than the solution to the problem. Dragon 1, this is Colonel Davidson, came a new voice on the radio. I want to review your mission profile one more time before you launch. Sarah took a deep breath. Davidson had been reluctant to approve her more aggressive tactical approaches, favoring a cautious plan that she knew wouldn't work. But she'd learned to pick her battles, and this wasn't the time to argue with her commanding officer. Roger, Control. Mission profile calls for low-level ingress via Route Alpha, maintaining 500 feet AGL through the mountain passes. Once I reach the target area, I'll climb to 1,000 feet for target identification, then execute close air support as needed. Negative on the 500 feet, Davidson replied immediately. Maintain 1,000 feet minimum altitude throughout the approach. That's a direct order. Sarah felt her heart sink. 1,000 feet was too high. The enemy would spot her long before she could effectively engage their positions. But Davidson's tone made it clear this wasn't open for discussion. Control, respectfully request permission to fly the lower altitude profile, she said. Try to keep the frustration out of her voice. 1,000 feet puts me in the engagement envelope of their shoulder-fired missiles. Dragon 1, you'll maintain 1,000 feet minimum. That altitude provides better situational awareness and reduces terrain collision risk. Execute the mission as briefed. Pierce's voice cut into the conversation. Sir, Captain Shin has a point about the missile threat. The SA-7s they're using are effective up to about 8,000 feet, but they're most dangerous in the middle altitude ranges. Major Pierce, the decision has been made, Davidson replied curtly. Dragon 1, do you copy your altitude restrictions? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, weighing her options. She could follow orders exactly as given and probably watch Rodriguez get captured or killed because she couldn't get close enough to help. Or she could trust her judgment and tactical experience, knowing that disobeying a direct order would end her career permanently. Dragon 1 copies 1,000 feet minimum, she said finally, making her decision. She'd follow orders until the tactical situation demanded otherwise. Rodriguez's life was more important than her career prospects. Nella's Control, Dragon 1 is ready for takeoff clearance. Dragon 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Good luck, Captain. The F-16 responded instantly to her control inputs, accelerating down the runway with the smooth power she remembered from thousands of hours in similar cockpits. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, Sarah felt 3 years of frustration and doubt falling away behind her. Whatever happened in the next hour, she was flying again. The Nevada desert stretched out below her as she climbed to cruise altitude, the familiar landscape taking on new significance now that she was heading into actual combat. She'd flown training missions over this same terrain countless times, but today felt different. Today, someone's life depended on her performance. Dragon 1, this is Nella's Control. Pierce's voice broke in her thoughts. Latest intelligence update shows increased radio traffic in the target area. Estimates 6 to 8 hostile personnel with small arms and at least 2 SAM systems. Sarah absorbed the information while running mental calculations. 8 hostiles meant she'd need to be precise with her weapons employment, taking out the SAM sites first before dealing with personnel threats. The F-16 carried a mixed load of AGM, 65 Maverick missiles for precision strikes, and 20mm cannon round for close support. Control, Dragon 1 copies the threat update. Request clarification on rules of engagement. Davidson's voice answered immediately. Dragon 1, you are authorized to engage any hostile forces that pose a direct threat to the down pilot. Minimize collateral damage, and avoid engagement with forces not directly threatening Rodriguez's position. As she approached the mountain range that separated her from the target area, Sarah began her descent to the altitude Davidson had specified. 1,000 feet above ground level put her uncomfortably high for the type of flying she needed to do, but she'd work with what she had. The terrain below shifted from open desert to rugged mountains, deep valleys carved by millennia of erosion, creating a maze of possible approach routes. Sarah had studied this area extensively during her grounding, using satellite imagery and topographic maps to understand every ridge, every canyon, every possible hiding spot. Dragon 1, this is Bandits 4. Rodriguez's voice suddenly filled her headset, weak but clear. I can hear vehicles getting closer. They're maybe 10 minutes out from my position. 10 minutes. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, feeling the F-16's acceleration press her back into the ejection seat. She had to reach Rodriguez before the enemy did, which meant taking risks that Davidson's conservative flight plan didn't allow for. Bandits 4, Dragon 1, is 5 minutes out from your position. Can you give me a visual reference for your location? Dragon 1, I'm in a cluster of large boulders on the east side of a dry creek bed. There's a distinctive red rock formation about 200 meters to my north. Sarah checked her moving map display, correlating Rodriguez's description with the terrain features she could see ahead. The red rock formation was clearly visible, which meant she was close enough to start looking for threats. Control, Dragon 1 has visual on the target area, she reported. Beginning tactical assessment. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see the terrain in high-definition detail. The dry creek bed Rodriguez had mentioned was clearly visible, along with the red rock formation he'd used as a reference point. But she could also see something else that made her blood run cold. 3 vehicles were moving along a dirt road that paralleled the creek bed, heading directly toward Rodriguez's position. Even worse, she could see personnel dismounting from the vehicles, spreading out in what was obviously a coordinated search pattern. Control, I have 3 vehicles and approximately 8 personnel conducting an active search in the target area, Sarah reported. They're going to find Rodriguez in the next few minutes. Dragon 1, maintain your altitude and observe, Davidson ordered. Do not engage until you have positive identification of hostile intent. Sarah stared at her displays in disbelief. The enemy forces were clearly searching for Rodriguez. They were armed with military weapons, and they'd already shot down 1 American aircraft. How much more proof of hostile intent did Davidson need? Control, these forces shot down an American aircraft. They're conducting an armed search for an American pilot. That seems like pretty clear hostile intent to me. Dragon 1, maintain altitude and observe. That's an order. Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched as the search teams moved closer to Rodriguez's hiding spot. She could see individual personnel carrying assault rifles and what looked like portable SAM launchers. One team was less than 100 meters from the boulder cluster where Rodriguez was hidden. That's when everything went wrong. Rodriguez's voice exploded across the radio. Contact. I'm taking fire. They found my position. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple weapons as the enemy forces converged on Rodriguez's location. The pilot was pinned down behind the boulders, with hostile forces advancing from 3 directions. Control, Bandits 4 is under direct fire, Sarah called out, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Request immediate clearance to engage. Dragon 1, are you certain of friendly positions? Davidson's voice carried the careful tone of someone making life and death decisions from the safety of a control room. Positive friendly position, multiple hostiles engaging with small arms, Sarah replied. I need clearance now. Dragon 1, you are cleared to engage hostile forces. Be advised, maintain minimum altitude of 1,000 feet. Sarah looked at her altimeter. She was at exactly 1,000 feet, which put her in the worst possible position for close air support. Too high for accurate cannon fire. Too close for safe missile employment with friendly forces nearby. Davidson's altitude restriction was going to get Rodriguez killed. But Rodriguez didn't have time for her to argue with Davidson about tactical procedures. Through her targeting pod, she could see the enemy forces getting closer to his position with every passing second. Sarah made her decision. She pushed the F-16's nose down, descending rapidly toward the canyon floor. Her altimeter spun downward. 800 feet, 600 feet, 400 feet. At 200 feet above the rocky terrain, she leveled off and began her attack run. Dragon 1, you are below minimum altitude. Pierce's voice cut across the radio. Climb immediately. Negative control. I'm engaging at optimum altitude for target discrimination. Sarah replied, her voice calm despite flying at barely twice the height of the surrounding ridgelines. The first target was a SAM team positioned on a small rise overlooking Rodriguez's hiding spot. Sarah lined up the shot, her finger hovering over the cannon trigger. At this altitude, she could clearly distinguish between hostile forces and the boulder cluster where Rodriguez was hiding. The 20mm cannon spoke with its distinctive buzzsaw sound, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the SAM position. The enemy emplacement disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. Direct hit on SAM's sight, Sarah called out, already maneuvering for her next attack. One threat neutralized, but the remaining enemy forces were reacting to her presence, swinging their weapons skyward as they sought to engage the attacking aircraft. Sarah could see tracers reaching up toward her F-16 as she banked hard to avoid their fire. Dragon 1, climb to safe altitude, Davidson ordered. You're too low for effective maneuvering. Sarah ignored the order, focusing on the tactical situation developing below. The remaining enemy forces had Rodriguez pinned down, and they were close enough to overwhelm his position if she didn't act fast. But flying at 200 feet in mountainous terrain while taking ground fire was like threading a needle in a hurricane. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah lined up her second attack run. Rodriguez was counting on her. Davidson was watching every move. And somewhere in the mountains below, hostile forces were trying to kill them both. The next few minutes would determine whether Sarah Chin's return to combat flying was a triumphant vindication or a catastrophic mistake that cost multiple American lives. Either way, there was no going back now. The F-16 shuddered as ground fire bracketed Sarah's aircraft, tracer rounds streaking past her canopy like deadly fireworks. Flying at 200 feet above the rocky terrain, every boulder and ridge represented a potential collision, while every muzzle flash below meant someone was trying to kill her. Dragon 1 climbed to safe altitude immediately. Davidson's voice cracked with authority and barely controlled panic. That's a direct order. Sarah ignored the radio chatter. Her entire focus narrowed to the tactical situation unfolding below. Through her heads-up display, she could see Rodriguez's position clearly marked, surrounded by hostile forces that were closing in from three directions. The downed pilot's survival depended on her ability to eliminate the threats without hitting friendly forces, a task that required precision flying at dangerously low altitude. Bandits 4, this is Dragon 1, Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I need you to mark your exact position with whatever you've got, flare, signal mirror, anything that shows up on thermal. Dragon 1, I've on emergency strobe, Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with stress. Activating now. Sarah's targeting pod immediately picked up the infrared signature of Rodriguez's strobe, a bright white pulse against the darker background of the boulder field. Now she could see exactly where the friendly pilot was located, which meant she could engage the hostile forces with confidence. The second SAM team was positioned on a ridgeline about 300 meters north of Rodriguez's location, their missile launcher clearly visible through the F-16 sensors. Sarah banked hard to the right, using a rock outcropping to mask her approach while lining up for another cannon run. Dragon 1, you are violating direct orders. Davidson's voice carried the cold fury of a commander whose authority was being openly challenged. Climb to minimum altitude or abort the mission. Sarah's finger tightened on the cannon trigger as she ignored Davidson's order. The hostile SAM team was tracking her aircraft, their missile launcher swiveling to follow her movement. If she climbed to Davidson's prescribed altitude, she'd be a perfect target for their surface-to-air missiles. The 20mm cannon erupted again, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the enemy position. The SAM launcher disappeared in a flash of flame and smoke, eliminating the most dangerous threat to her aircraft. Second SAM site neutralized, Sarah reported, already maneuvering for her next attack. Multiple small arms positions remaining. But the remaining enemy forces weren't waiting passively to be destroyed. They were moving, using the terrain to their advantage while converging on Rodriguez's position from multiple directions. Sarah could see at least 6 personnel with assault rifles, advancing in a coordinated pattern that would overwhelm the downed pilot within minutes. Bandits 4, I count 6 hostiles approaching your position, Sarah called out. Can you displace to better cover? Negative, Dragon 1, Rodriguez replied. I took shrapnel in my leg when I ejected. I can move, but not fast enough to outrun them. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as the tactical situation became clear. Rodriguez was wounded and immobile, surrounded by hostile forces that would reach his position in less than 5 minutes. She had to eliminate the remaining threats quickly and accurately, which meant continuing to fly at an altitude that violated direct orders. The next attack run required threading her F-16 between 2 ridge lines while engaging targets that were uncomfortably close to Rodriguez's position. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she could hit the friendly pilot she was trying to save. Dragon 1, this is Colonel Davidson, came a new transmission, the commanding officer's voice carrying deadly calm. You will climb to minimum altitude immediately, or I will order Major Pierce to declare you a rogue aircraft and vector interceptors to your position. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. Davidson wasn't just threatening to end her mission. He was threatening to treat her as an enemy aircraft. If she continued disobeying orders, other F-16s would be launched to force her to land, or, in the worst-case scenario, shoot her down. Control, Dragon 1 understands the consequences, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. But Captain Rodriguez doesn't have time for minimum altitude procedures. I'm staying low and eliminating the remaining threats. Dragon 1, you are relieved of command, Davidson declared. Major Pierce, take control of the mission and order that aircraft to return to base immediately. For a moment, the radio frequency was silent except for the sound of Sarah's breathing inside her oxygen mask. She was now officially a rogue pilot, disobeying direct orders while engaging enemy forces on American soil. Her military career was effectively over, regardless of the mission outcome. But Rodriguez was still pinned down by hostile forces, and Sarah was the only thing standing between the wounded pilot and capture or death. Career consequences would have to wait. Sarah, this is Jessica. Major Pierce's voice cut across the frequency, using first names instead of official call signs. I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're about 10 seconds away from having F-16 scrambled to intercept you. Sarah banked hard to the left, lining up for another attack run while Pierce continued talking. Through her targeting pod, she could see the remaining hostile personnel getting closer to Rodriguez's position with every passing second. I understand the situation, Jessica, Sarah replied. But I'm not leaving Rodriguez to die because Davidson is worried about regulations. Damn it, Sarah. I'm not asking you to leave him. Pierce shot back. I'm asking you to trust me. Give me 2 minutes to work something out. 2 minutes. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and weapon status while calculating the time it would take the remaining enemy forces to reach Rodriguez's position. She had enough fuel for maybe 3 more attack runs, but Rodriguez didn't have 2 minutes. Jessica, Rodriguez is wounded and the hostiles are less than 200 meters from his position, Sarah said. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen now. Dragon 1, this is Bandits 4. Rodriguez's voice suddenly filled the frequency. I can see them moving between the boulders. They're going to be on top of me in about 60 seconds. Sarah felt time compressing around her as she lined up for what might be her final attack run. The remaining hostile forces were spread out among the rocks, making individual targeting difficult without risking hits on Rodriguez's position. She needed perfect accuracy with minimum margin for error. Control, Dragon 1 is engaging remaining targets, Sarah announced, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding her. If you're going to stop me, you better do it in the next 30 seconds. She dove toward the canyon floor, her F-16 screaming through the mountain air at barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain. At this altitude, she could see individual enemy personnel moving between the boulders, their weapons clearly visible as they advanced on Rodriguez's position. The first burst of cannon fire caught two hostiles in the open, eliminating them instantly. Sarah pulled up sharply, using her vertical energy to climb above a ridge before banking back for another attack. Her aircraft was taking light small arms fire, but nothing that penetrated the F-16's armor. Dragon 1. You have two F-16s launched from Nellis. Pierce's voice carried across the frequency. They're 15 minutes out and cleared to use any means necessary to terminate your mission. 15 minutes. Sarah had 15 minutes to finish eliminating the hostile forces, coordinate Rodriguez's rescue, and somehow avoid being shot down by her own side. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 3 years of being grounded for being too aggressive, she was now considered dangerous enough to require lethal force to stop. Bandits 4, what's your status? Sarah called out as she maneuvered for another attack run. Dragon 1, I count 4 hostiles remaining, maybe 50 meters from my position, Rodriguez replied. They know exactly where I am now. 4 hostiles, 50 meters. Sarah could see them through her targeting pod, moving with tactical precision as they closed in on Rodriguez's hiding spot. They were professionals, not random militia members, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah lined up her final attack run, diving toward the canyon floor with her remaining cannon rounds. At this distance and altitude, she could distinguish between individual enemy personnel and the boulder cluster where Rodriguez was hidden. But as she pressed the trigger, something went wrong. The F-16's cannon jammed after firing only a few rounds, leaving Sarah with no weapons and, for hostile personnel, still closing on Rodriguez's position. She was out of ammunition, out of time, and about to be intercepted by friendly aircraft ordered to stop her by any means necessary. Control, Dragon 1 is Winchester, Sarah reported, using the military term for out of ammunition. Cannon malfunction, no remaining ordnance. The frequency erupted with multiple voices as everyone realized the implications. Sarah had no weapons left, Rodriguez was about to be captured, and interceptor aircraft were closing in to end her mission permanently. Dragon 1, return to base immediately, Davidson ordered. You've done what you can. Sarah looked at her tactical display, seeing Rodriguez's position marked by the steady pulse of his emergency strobe. Below, she could see the remaining hostile forces moving through the boulders, less than 30 meters from the wounded pilot's location. She was out of ammunition, but she wasn't out of options. Control, Dragon 1 has one more idea, Sarah said, her voice carrying a calm determination that surprised everyone listening. I'm going to try something that's either brilliant or insane. Sarah, what are you planning? Pierce asked, her voice tight with concern. Sarah didn't answer immediately, her mind calculating angles, speeds, and distances while her hand began adjusting the F-16's configuration. What she was planning had never been attempted in combat, but the tactical situation left her no other choice. Tell the interceptors to give me 3 more minutes, Sarah said finally. Either I save Rodriguez in the next 3 minutes, or there won't be anything left to save. As she spoke, Sarah was already diving back toward the canyon floor, the F-16's engine screaming as she descended toward the rocky terrain at maximum speed. She was about to attempt something that would either go down in military history as a stroke of tactical genius, or get both her and Rodriguez killed in the next 60 seconds. Sarah Chun pushed the F-16 into a dive that would have terrified most pilots, her aircraft screaming toward the rocky canyon floor at over 400 miles per hour. With no ammunition left and hostile forces seconded away from capturing Rodriguez, she was about to attempt a maneuver that existed only in theoretical discussions and training simulations. Dragon 1, what are you doing? Pierce's voice cracked across the radio, barely audible over the roar of wind and engine noise. Sarah didn't answer immediately, her entire focus concentrated on the calculations racing through her mind. Speed, altitude, angle of attack, wind direction. Every variable had to be perfect, or she'd slam her F-16 in the mountainside while accomplishing nothing. I'm going to buzz the hostiles, Sarah finally replied, her voice steady despite pulling over 4GS in her descent. Shock and awe at 0 altitude. Through her heads-up display, She could see the tactical situation developing in real time. The 4 remaining enemy personnel were less than 20 meters from Rodriguez's position, moving with military precision through the boulder field. They knew exactly where the American pilot was hiding, and they had him completely surrounded. What they didn't expect was an F-16 Fighting Falcon diving toward them at maximum speed, its twin engines producing over 30,000 pounds of thrust and a sound signature that could shatter windows at close range. Dragon 1, that's insane. Davidson's voice cut across the frequency. You'll kill everyone down there, including Rodriguez. Not if I do it right, Sarah replied, pulling the aircraft out of its dive at barely 30 feet above the canyon floor. The F-16's wingtips cleared the tallest boulders by mere feet as she leveled off for her supersonic pass. At this altitude and speed, the jet wash from her aircraft would be devastating to anything on the ground. The combination of engine exhaust, pressure waves, and acoustic shock would hit the enemy personnel like an invisible sledgehammer, potentially stunning or disorienting them long enough for Rodriguez to escape. But the maneuver was incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. Flying supersonic at 30 feet above rocky terrain meant that one small mistake, one moment of inattention, would turn her F-16 into an expanding fireball. Even if she executed the pass perfectly, the shock waves could injure Rodriguez as much as the enemy forces. Bandits 4, this is Dragon 1, Sarah called out, her voice urgent as she approached the target area. I need you to get as low as possible and cover your head. This is going to be loud. Dragon 1, I'm as low as I can get, Rodriguez replied. Do whatever you're going to do. Sarah could see the enemy personnel through her canopy now, individual figures moving between the boulders with assault rifles ready. They were focused on their search pattern, completely unaware that death was approaching them at supersonic speed. The F-16 broke the sound barrier just as Sarah reached the canyon where Rodriguez was hidden, the sonic boom echoing off the rock walls like thunder. But that was just the opening act of what she had planned. She pulled the aircraft into a knife-edge maneuver, rolling the F-16 onto its side while maintaining minimum altitude. The maneuver directed the full force of her jet washed downward into the canyon, creating a hurricane-force wind that struck the ground like an invisible bomb. The effect was immediate and devastating. Through her rearview mirrors, Sarah could see dust and debris exploding upward as her jet wash hit the canyon floor. Loose rocks became projectiles, sand became a blinding cloud, and the acoustic shock from her engines at close range would be powerful enough to disorient anyone caught in the open. Direct hit, Sarah called out, pulling up sharply to avoid the canyon walls. Bandits 4, report your status. For several seconds, there was no response from Rodriguez. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she wondered if her desperate maneuver had worked or if she'd just killed the pilot she was trying to save. Dragon 1, this is Bandits 4. Rodriguez's voice finally crackled across the radio, weak but clear. I don't know what the hell you just did, but it worked. The hostiles are down, and I think some of them are running. Sarah felt a surge of relief, so powerful it made her hands shake on the controls. The supersonic buzz had worked, stunning the enemy personnel and giving Rodriguez the opportunity he needed to escape immediate capture. Can you move to a better position? Sarah asked, already planning her next move. Affirmative, Dragon 1. My leg's still messed up, but I can make it to that red rock formation we talked about. Better cover and easier extraction point. Roger, move to the red rocks and wait for pickup, Sarah replied. I'll provide overwatch until the cavalry arrives. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew her own situation was becoming critical. The 2 interceptor F-16s launched from Nellis were getting closer, and she was officially a rogue pilot who disobeyed direct orders. Davidson had made it clear that she would be treated as hostile if she didn't comply with orders to return to base. Dragon 1, this is Thunderbolt Flight, came a new voice on the radio. We are 2 F-16s, currently 15 miles from your position and closing. You are ordered to proceed immediately to Nellis Air Force Base. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and tactical display. She had enough fuel for maybe 10 more minutes of flight time, which meant she couldn't stay to provide cover for Rodriguez's extraction. But she also couldn't leave until she was sure the rescue helicopters were en route. Thunderbolt Flight. Dragon 1 understands your orders, Sarah replied. Request permission to remain on station until search and rescue arrives. Negative, Dragon 1. You will proceed to Nellis immediately, or we are authorized to use force to compel compliance. The threat was clear and unambiguous. If Sarah didn't return to base immediately, her fellow pilots would be ordered to shoot her down. It was the ultimate irony. After spending 3 years grounded for being too aggressive, she was now considered dangerous enough to require lethal force. Dragon 1. This is Rescue 6, came another transmission from an unexpected source. We are a flight of HH-60 helicopters en route to pick up Bandits 4. ETA to target area is 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge again, calculating whether she could stay on station long enough to ensure Rodriguez's safe extraction. The math was close, but it was possible if she managed her fuel consumption carefully. Thunderbolt Flight. Dragon 1 requests 8 minutes to ensure successful extraction of Bandits 4, Sarah transmitted. I'll return to base as soon as the rescue helicopters have Rodriguez secured. Dragon 1. You have been given direct orders to return to base, came the reply from the lead interceptor. We are not authorized to negotiate compliance. Sarah found herself in an impossible position. She could follow orders and leave Rodriguez vulnerable during the critical extraction phase, or she could remain on station and risk being shot down by her own side. Either choice could result in the death of an American pilot. This is Major Pierce, came a transmission that surprised everyone. Thunderbolt Flight. I am assuming tactical command of this operation. Dragon 1 is authorized to remain on station until Rescue 6 completes extraction. Control. We were ordered by Colonel Davidson to bring Dragon 1 back immediately, the interceptor pilot replied. Thunderbolt Flight. I am countermanding that order under emergency authority, Pierce responded. Dragon 1 will return to base after ensuring successful rescue operations. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Pierce, who was clearly risking her own career to give Sarah the time she needed to complete the mission. But she also knew that Pierce's intervention was only temporary. Once they returned to Nellis, there would be consequences for everyone involved. Dragon 1 copies. Remaining on station for extraction support, Sarah acknowledged. The next 8 minutes felt like hours as Sarah orbited the canyon area, watching for any signs of renewed hostile activity while the rescue helicopters approached Rodriguez's position. Her fuel gauge continued its steady descent toward minimum levels, but she forced herself to focus on the tactical situation rather than her own limitations. Rescue 6 has visual on Bandits 4, came a transmission from the lead helicopter. Beginning extraction now. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see the HH-60 helicopter hovering over the Red Rock Formation where Rodriguez had taken shelter. Rescue personnel rappelled down to the pilot's position while the helicopter maintained a stable hover despite the turbulent mountain air. Bandits 4 is secure, came the report from Rescue 6. We have him aboard and are departing the area. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders as she watched the rescue helicopter climb away from the canyon, carrying Rodriguez to safety. The mission was complete. She'd saved a fellow pilot's life despite being grounded for 3 years, despite disobeying direct orders, despite facing the threat of being shot down by her own Air Force. Dragon 1, this is a Thunderbolt Flight, came the transmission from the interceptors. Rescue operations complete. You are directed to return to Nellis immediately. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge one final time, calculating her options. She had just enough fuel to make it back to base if she flew a direct route at maximum efficiency. Any delays or deviations would leave her gliding toward the runway on fumes. Thunderbolt Flight, Dragon 1 is RTB, Sarah replied, using the military abbreviation for returning to base. Thanks for your patience. The flight back to Nellis was surreal, flying in formation with the 2 aircraft that had been prepared to shoot her down minutes earlier. Sarah's mind raced through everything that had happened, from the emergency alarm that morning to her supersonic buzz of enemy forces in the canyon. She'd saved Rodriguez's life, but at what cost? She'd disobeyed direct orders, violated altitude restrictions, and effectively gone rogue during a combat operation. Her flying career was almost certainly over, regardless of the successful mission outcome. As Nellis Air Force Base came into view ahead, Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their lights flashing in preparation for her arrival. She'd requested no special assistance, but it was clear that her unconventional mission had attracted significant attention. Dragon 1, Nellis Tower, you are clear to land runway 27, came a transmission from air traffic control. Emergency vehicles are standing by as precautionary measure. Sarah lined up for her final approach, the F-16 responding smoothly to her control inputs, despite the stress of the morning's operations. As the aircraft touched down on the runway, she felt a strange mixture of triumph and dread. She'd proven that the grounding had been wrong, but she'd also proven that she was exactly the kind of maverick pilot that Davidson had worried about. The F-16 rolled to a stop in front of the maintenance hangar where this whole adventure had begun. Through her canopy, Sarah could see a crowd of personnel waiting for her, including several officers whose expressions suggested that her reception would not be entirely positive. As she shut down the aircraft's systems and prepared to face the consequences of her actions, Sarah Chun reflected on the morning's events. She'd been grounded for 3 years, dismissed as too aggressive and unreliable for combat operations. Today, she'd proven that sometimes aggressive and unreliable were exactly what the situation demanded. Captain Rodriguez was alive because she'd been willing to disobey orders and risk everything to bring him home. Whether that would be enough to vindicate 3 years of forced inactivity remained to be seen. But as Sarah climbed down from the F-16's cockpit, she knew one thing for certain. She was still the pilot she'd always been, grounded or not. Today, that had made all the difference between life and death for a fellow aviator. Tomorrow, she'd face whatever consequences her actions had earned. Either way, Captain Sarah Chun was flying again.